The dust swirled around Margaret's worn leather boots as she clutched her carpet bag tighter against her chest. The train station in Cedar Falls was nothing more than a weathered wooden platform with a crooked sign and a single bench that had seen better days. The September sun beat down mercilessly on her black morning dress, but she didn't move from where she sat. 3 days had passed since she'd stepped off the westbound train, and still she remained, watching the horizon where the railway tracks disappeared into shimmering heat waves. She had nowhere else to go. The telegram had been brief and devastating. Her husband Thomas was dead, killed in a mining accident outside Denver. The company offered their condolences and a train ticket back east, but Margaret had sold everything she owned to follow Thomas west. There was nothing left for her in Philadelphia except memories she'd rather forget. So she sat on that bench, paralyzed between a past that held only sorrow and a future that seemed impossible to imagine. The station master, a kindly man named Pete with silver whiskers and gentle eyes, had tried to coax her into the station house. "Ma'am, you can't sleep out here again tonight. There's coyotes in these parts and worse." But Margaret had simply shaken her head, clutching the small photograph of Thomas that she kept in her coat pocket. She had $17 to her name and a wedding ring that caught the light when she twisted it nervously around her finger. On the third morning, as the dawn painted the desert sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A man on horseback emerged from the dusty main street, riding slowly toward the station. He was tall in the saddle, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world, and wore a hat that had seen countless sunrises just like this one. Behind him, perched on the back of the horse, was a small girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her blonde hair was braided neatly, but her dress showed signs of a man's attempt at laundry, with uneven patches and loose threads that spoke of a father doing his best without a woman's touch. The man dismounted and helped the little girl down before tying his horse to the post near the platform. Margaret watched as he knelt to straighten the child's dress and smooth a wayward strand of hair from her face. There was something infinitely tender in the gesture, a love so pure and protective that it made Margaret's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Now remember what we talked about, Annie," the man said softly, his voice carrying the roughened edges of someone who spent most of his words on horses and cattle rather than people. "You wait right here while I go into town for supplies. Don't you wander off, you hear?" The little girl nodded solemnly, her blue eyes bright with the kind of trust that only children possess. "I'll be good, Papa. I promise." The man stood and tipped his hat politely toward Margaret before heading into town, his spurs jingling with each step. The little girl settled herself on the far end of the bench, swinging her legs and humming a tune that sounded like a lullaby. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, two souls sharing the morning sun and the endless expanse of the frontier. "Are you waiting for the train too?" the child asked suddenly, her voice clear as a bell in the still air. Margaret turned to look at her properly for the first time. The girl had her father's strong jaw and determined chin, but her eyes held a sadness that no child should carry. "I suppose I am," Margaret replied, though she wasn't sure which train she was waiting for or where it might take her. "I'm Annie," the girl announced, scooting a little closer on the bench. "What's your name?" "Margaret. Mrs. Margaret Coleman." The words felt strange on her tongue. She'd been Mrs. Coleman for such a short time, barely 2 years of marriage before Thomas had been taken from her. "That's a pretty name," Annie said with the earnest sincerity that children possessed. "Are you sad? You look like you've been crying." Margaret touched her cheek, surprised to find it damp. She hadn't even realized she was crying. "Yes, sweetheart, I suppose I am sad." Annie nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Papa says it's okay to be sad sometimes. He gets sad too, especially when he looks at Mama's picture before bedtime." She paused, studying Margaret with curious eyes. "Did someone you love go to heaven?" The simple question, asked with such innocent directness, nearly broke Margaret's composure entirely. "Yes," she whispered. "My husband. He was going to build us a house out here. We were going to start a family. That's what Papa wanted too," Annie said softly. "But Mama went to heaven when I was born, and now it's just me and Papa. He tries real hard, but I think he gets lonely. Sometimes I hear him talking to Mama's picture when he thinks I'm asleep." Margaret felt her heart clench at the image of this strong man pouring out his loneliness to a photograph in the dark hours of night. She recognized the particular ache of grief that made people seek comfort in one-sided conversations with the dead. "Where is your papa now?" Margaret asked. "Getting supplies in town. We live on a ranch about 5 miles north of here. Papa raises cattle and horses. He's real good with horses. He says they understand him better than most people do." Annie swung her legs thoughtfully. "Do you know about horses, Margaret?" "I'm afraid I don't know much about ranch life at all," Margaret admitted. "I lived in the city before I came west." Annie's eyes widened with fascination. "A real city, with lots of buildings and people everywhere." "Yes, lots of buildings. Sometimes so many people you could hardly walk down the street." "That sounds scary," Annie decided. "I like having space to run and play. Papa built me a swing on the big oak tree by our house, and I can see for miles and miles from up there. When the cattle come home in the evening, they look like tiny dots moving across the grass." Margaret found herself smiling for the first time in days. There was something utterly charming about this little girl's perspective on the world, something that made the vast emptiness of the frontier seem less daunting and more like possibility. "It sounds beautiful," Margaret said. "It is," Annie agreed. "But it gets awful quiet sometimes, especially at supper time. Papa and I don't talk much when we eat. He asks if I learned my letters, and I tell him about what I did during the day, but then we just sit and chew and listen to the wind." Mama's chair is still at the table, but nobody sits in it. The picture Annie painted was achingly familiar. Margaret remembered the silence that had filled her Philadelphia boarding house room after Thomas left for Colorado, the way conversations with herself had become her primary companionship. But here was a little girl living that same loneliness, and a man who was probably struggling to raise his daughter while managing the demanding work of a ranch. "Your papa sounds like a good man," Margaret said. "He's the best papa in the whole world," Annie declared with fierce loyalty. "He braids my hair every morning, even though he's not very good at it yet, and he reads me stories before bed, even when he's real tired from working all day. He makes the best flapjacks too, almost as good as Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring ranch." Margaret could picture it all so clearly, the patient father fumbling with hair ribbons, the bedtime stories read by lamplight, the morning ritual of breakfast shared in the kitchen of a house that was trying its best to be a home, despite the absence that haunted it. "Does your papa ever think about marrying again?" Margaret asked gently. Annie's face grew serious. "I asked him about that once. He said Mama was the only woman he could ever love that way, and it wouldn't be fair to marry someone if his heart still belonged to someone else." She paused, then added with startling wisdom, "But I think he's wrong about that. I think hearts can get bigger, not smaller. Like when I love my horse Buttercup, it doesn't mean I love Papa any less." Out of the mouths of babes, Margaret thought. This 6-year-old child understood something about love that many adults never grasp it, that it wasn't a finite resource to be hoarded and protected, but something that grew stronger when shared. "That's very wise, Annie. Papa needs someone to take care of him." Annie continued with the matter-of-fact tone children used when stating obvious truths. "Hay forgets to eat sometimes when he's worried about the cattle, and he patches his shirts instead of sewing them proper. Mrs. Henderson says he's too proud to ask for help, but I think he's just forgotten how." Margaret felt a stirring of something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died, the desire to nurture, to care for someone, to be needed. In Philadelphia, she'd been a school teacher before her marriage, accustomed to looking after others and finding purpose in their well-being. These past months of grief had left her feeling useless, as if her capacity for love had died along with her husband. But listening to Annie talk about her father, Margaret began to imagine what it might be like to bring order and warmth to a ranch house, to braid a little girl's hair properly, to ensure that a hard-working man didn't forget to eat. It wouldn't be the same as what she'd planned with Thomas, but perhaps it could still be meaningful. "Tell me more about your ranch," Margaret said. Annie's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Oh, it's the most wonderful place! We have a big barn with hay in the loft that's perfect for jumping. Papa says I'm not supposed to jump from too high, but sometimes I do anyway when he's not looking, and we have chickens that give us eggs every morning. I named them all, but Papa says I'm not supposed to get too attached because sometimes we have to eat chicken for dinner." She wrinkled her nose. "I don't like chicken dinner very much anymore." Margaret laughed, a sound that surprised her with its genuineness. "I can imagine that would be difficult. And we have the most beautiful garden, or we did before Mama died." Now it's all overgrown with weeds. Papa tried to keep it up the first year, but he doesn't know which plants are flowers and which are weeds, so he gave up. I miss the tomatoes most. Mama made the best tomato preserves. The more Annie talked, the more real the picture became in Margaret's mind. She could see herself kneeling in that overgrown garden, pulling weeds and coaxing flowers back to life. She could imagine standing at the stove, stirring tomato preserves while Annie helped by stirring too much and getting more on herself than in the pot. "It sounds like your mama was a very special woman," Margaret said. "She was," Annie agreed solemnly. "Papa has her picture on the mantel, and sometimes I catch him just staring at it with the saddest look on his face. I try to be extra good on those days so he won't be so sad. But I don't think it helps much." Margaret's heart went out to this little girl who was trying to heal her father's broken heart through her own good behavior. It was a burden no child should have to carry, yet here was Annie, accepting it with the stoic grace that seemed to be bred into people who chose to make their lives on the frontier. "Annie, can I ask you something?" "Sure, Mrs. Margaret. If your papa could find someone to help take care of you both, someone who would love you and make sure you were happy and safe, would you want that?" Annie considered this question with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. Would she be nice to Papa? Would she read me stories and teach me to braid hair proper? Would she help me take care of the chickens and not eat them for dinner? Margaret smiled. I think she would try her very best to do all of those things. Then yes, Annie decided. I would want that very much. Papa deserves to be happy. And I think I'd like having a mama again, even if she wasn't my real mama. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun climb higher in the morning sky. Margaret felt something shifting inside her chest, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. The grief was still there, but it no longer seemed to fill every corner of her heart. There was room now for something else, something that felt like hope. "Mrs. Margaret." Annie's voice was small and uncertain. "Yes, dear. Are you going to get back on the train and go away?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with more weight than any child should have to carry. Margaret looked at this little girl who had somehow managed to crack open her sealed heart in the space of a single conversation, and she realized that getting back on the train was the last thing she wanted to do. "I don't know," Margaret said honestly. "I've been sitting here for 3 days trying to figure that out." Annie nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Sometimes when I can't decide something, I ask Papa what he thinks I should do. Maybe you could ask someone too. I don't have anyone to ask, sweetheart. My husband died, and I don't have any family left." Annie looked at her with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "Well," she said thoughtfully, "maybe you could ask for guidance. That's what Papa does when he doesn't know what to do about the ranch." Margaret hadn't prayed since the day she received the telegram about Thomas. She'd been too angry, too hurt, too convinced that whatever higher power there was had abandoned her when she needed it most. But sitting here in the morning sunshine with this wise little girl, she found herself wondering if perhaps she'd been the one who had done the abandoning. "That's good advice, Annie. Papa says help can come to us in different ways. Sometimes it's through other people, and sometimes it's through feelings in our hearts. And sometimes it's through things that happen that seem like miracles, but maybe they're just the world working in ways we don't expect." Margaret looked at Annie with new understanding. Here was a child who had lost her mother at birth, who was being raised by a grieving father on a lonely ranch, yet she spoke about hope and miracles with unshakable faith. Perhaps this meeting, this conversation, was itself one of those unexpected ways life worked in the world. "Annie, what would you think if I told you I was a teacher back east? That I know how to read and write and do arithmetic?" Annie's eyes grew wide. "A real teacher? Like in a real school?" "Yes, like in a real school. I taught children not much older than you." "Papa would love that," Annie exclaimed. "He worries all the time about my learning. He can read some, but not real good, and his writing is all crooked. He says I need proper schooling. But the nearest school is 2 days' ride from our ranch." Margaret felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Here was something she could offer, a way to be useful and needed again. She could teach Annie, and perhaps other ranch children in the area. She could help build the kind of community that the frontier desperately needed. "Would you like me to teach you, Annie?" "Oh, yes!" Annie clapped her hands together. "Could you teach me to read big books like Papa reads? And could you teach me to write letters so neat they look like pictures?" I could try, Margaret said, and meant it. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Annie's father was returning from town, his horse loaded down with supplies. He dismounted near the platform, and Margaret got her first good look at him in the full light of day. He was younger than she'd expected, probably not much older than her own 26 years. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were kind, and there was something in the way he moved that spoke of quiet strength and reliability. This was a man who kept his word, who worked hard, who loved his daughter with every fiber of his being. "Papa!" Annie jumped up from the bench and ran to him. "This is my new friend, Mrs. Margaret. She's been sitting here for 3 whole days, and she was a teacher back east, and she doesn't have anywhere to go because her husband went to heaven, just like Mama did." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment at Annie's enthusiastic but tactless introduction. She stood slowly, smoothing her wrinkled dress and trying to look more presentable than someone who had been sleeping on a train station bench for 3 nights. The man looked at her with curious eyes, taking in her morning dress, her carefully maintained posture despite her circumstances, and the way Annie had gravitated toward her with obvious affection. "Mom," he said, tipping his hat respectfully, "I'm sorry for your loss, and I apologize if my daughter has been bothering you. She's got a tendency to make friends with everyone she meets." "She hasn't been bothering me at all," Margaret assured him. "She's been wonderful company. You've raised a remarkable daughter, Mr. Dalton, James Dalton." He extended his hand, and Margaret noticed that his handshake was firm but gentle, calloused from hard work but careful of her smaller hands. "And you're Mrs. Coleman, Margaret Coleman." She paused, then added, "I was traveling west to meet my husband, but he was an accident." James nodded with understanding. The frontier was full of people carrying stories of loss and broken dreams. He didn't pry, didn't ask for details that would only cause pain. It was a kindness that Margaret appreciated more than she could express. "Papa," Annie said, tugging on her father's sleeve, "Mrs. Margaret doesn't have anywhere to go, and she knows all about teaching and taking care of people. Don't you think we could help her?" James looked embarrassed by his daughter's directness. "Annie, you can't just invite people to come live with us. Mrs. Coleman probably has her own plans." "Actually," Margaret said quietly, I truly don't have anywhere to go, Mr. Dalton. I've been sitting on this bench for 3 days trying to figure out what to do next." James studied her face, seeing the honesty there, the vulnerability she was trying so hard to hide behind her proper posture and careful words. "You're welcome to stay in town," he said. "Pete could probably help you find a room, or maybe work. There's always need for someone with education and manners." "Papa!" Annie stamped her foot in frustration. "You're not listening! Mrs. Margaret could come help us!" "She could teach me proper, and cook real meals and fix the garden. And maybe you wouldn't be so sad all the time." The blunt honesty of a child's words hung in the air between the 3 of them. James looked stricken that his daughter had noticed his sadness, had been carrying the weight of trying to fix it. Margaret saw the exact moment when he realized that his grief was affecting not just himself, but the little girl who depended on him for everything. "Annie, sweetheart," James said softly, kneeling to her level, "I'm not sad because of anything you did or didn't do. You make me happy every single day. It's just that you miss Mama." Annie finished for him. "I know, Papa. But maybe it's okay to miss Mama and still have room for someone new to care about. Like how I can love both you and Buttercup and my chickens all at the same time." Margaret watched this exchange with tears in her eyes. Here was a father and daughter navigating grief together, trying to figure out how to honor the past while still living in the present. It reminded her of her own struggle to decide whether moving forward meant betraying Thomas's memory. "Mr. Dalton," Margaret said carefully, "I don't want to impose, but I find myself in genuine need of work and shelter. I was a school teacher, as Annie mentioned, and I know how to keep house and manage domestic affairs. I'd be willing to work as a governess and housekeeper in exchange for room and board. Nothing more than that. Just a chance to be useful again." James stood slowly, his eyes searching her face. "You'd be willing to live on an isolated ranch. It's hard country, Mrs. Coleman. Closest neighbors are 5 miles away, and town is even farther. It gets lonely, especially for someone used to city life." "I think," Margaret said with a small smile, "that I'm already acquainted with loneliness, Mr. Dalton. At least at your ranch I'd have purpose. And you'd teach Annie. Give her proper schooling. I'd teach her everything I know. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography. I'd make sure she had the education she deserves. James looked down at his daughter, who was practically vibrating with excitement and hope. Then he looked back at Margaret, seeing something in her face that convinced him she was sincere, that she understood what she was asking for and what she was offering in return. The work is hard, he warned. Ranch life isn't easy, especially for a woman alone, and Annie can be a handful sometimes. I'm not a handful, Annie protested. I'm helpful, Margaret laughed, the sound surprising all of them with its warmth. I'm sure you're both helpful and a handful, Annie. That's what makes children interesting. James found himself smiling despite his reservations. There was something about this woman that put him at ease, something gentle and competent and kind. Annie had taken to her immediately, which was remarkable given how shy she usually was with strangers. The pay wouldn't be much, he said. I could offer room and board and maybe a small wage when the cattle sales are good. I don't need much, Margaret said. Just a chance to start over. Annie looked back and forth between the adults, holding her breath as if afraid that speaking might break whatever spell was weaving itself around the three of them. All right, James said finally. We can try it. See how it works out. If you change your mind or if it doesn't suit, I'll make sure you get back to town safely. Annie let out a whoop of joy that startled James's horse and made Margaret laugh again. Really, Papa. Really, truly. James confirmed, and Margaret saw him smile genuinely for the first time since she'd met him. Messes. Margaret! Annie threw her arms around Margaret's waist with enthusiastic affection. You're gonna love our ranch, and I'll show you everything. The barn and the chickens and Buttercup, and the creek where the water is so cold it makes your teeth hurt. Margaret hugged the little girl back, feeling something warm and hopeful unfurling in her chest. For the first time in months, she could picture a future that didn't feel empty or impossible. I can't wait to see it all, she said, and meant every word. As James helped her gather her few belongings and load them onto his horse, Margaret took one last look at the train station bench, where she'd spent 3 days waiting for direction. She'd thought she was waiting for a train, but perhaps she'd been waiting for something else entirely. Perhaps she'd been waiting for a little girl with wise eyes and a generous heart to ask the one question that could change everything. The ride to the Dalton Ranch took them through country that was both harsh and beautiful, with rolling hills covered in golden grass and distant mountains that seemed to touch the sky. Annie chattered the entire way, pointing out landmarks and telling stories about every tree and rock they passed. James rode quietly, occasionally adding details to his daughter's enthusiastic narration, but mostly just listening with the kind of patient attention that spoke of deep love. Margaret found herself relaxing as they rode, letting the vast openness of the landscape work its way into her soul. There was something healing about all this space, something that made her grief feel less suffocating and more like a natural part of the endless cycle of life and death, and renewal that played out on the frontier every day. When they finally arrived at the ranch, Margaret was struck by how perfectly it fit the picture Annie had painted with her words. The house was solid and well built, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and sides. The barn stood proudly in the distance, surrounded by corrals that held horses and cattle. There was the oak tree Annie had mentioned, with a simple rope swing hanging from one of its massive branches. But Margaret also saw what Annie had noticed: the overgrown garden choked with weeds, the windows that could use a woman's touch for proper cleaning, the small details of a house that was being maintained by a man doing his best, but lacking the skills or time to make it truly a home. It's beautiful, Margaret said, and meant it. Mama always said it had good bones, James said quietly. She had plans for fixing it up, making it something special. Maybe, Margaret said carefully. Those plans don't have to stay plans forever. James looked at her with surprise, then something that might have been gratitude. Maybe not, he agreed, that first evening. As Margaret helped Annie wash up for supper and braided her hair properly for the first time in months, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a comfortable shawl. This wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a life that needed her, a place where she could matter again. Later, after Annie was tucked into bed with a story and James had gone out to check on the animals one final time, Margaret sat on the front porch and looked up at more stars than she'd ever seen in the city. The night was vast and quiet, filled with the soft sounds of settling cattle and the distant call of a night bird. She thought about Thomas, about the future they'd planned together that would never be. The grief was still there, would probably always be there in some form, but it no longer felt like the only truth in her life. There was room now for other truths. The satisfaction of useful work, the joy of a child's laughter, the quiet companionship of a good man who understood loss and was learning to hope again. When James returned from his evening chores, he found her still sitting on the porch, her face peaceful in the starlight. "No regrets yet?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "No regrets," Margaret confirmed. "Though ask me again when I'm trying to teach Annie long division." James chuckled. "She's smart as a whip, but she's got her own ideas about how things should work. Most of the best students do," Margaret said. "They keep teachers on their toes." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people who had both lost everything they thought they wanted and were now tentatively building something neither had expected to find. "Mrs. Coleman," James said eventually. "Margaret," she corrected gently. "If we're going to be sharing a household, even as employer and employee, we might as well use first names." "Margaret, then. And I'm James." He paused, then continued. "I want you to know that I don't expect. That is, this arrangement is exactly what you said. Work in exchange for room and board. I don't want you to think I have any other expectations." Margaret appreciated his honesty and the respect behind it. "Thank you, James. I'm grateful for your directness. It's just that Annie has some ideas about." He trailed off, embarrassed. "About what?" Margaret prompted. "She's got it in her head that every house needs a mama and a papa. She's been asking me about getting married again, and now that you're here..." He shook his head. "I just don't want you to feel pressured or uncomfortable." Margaret considered her words carefully. "James, we've both lost the people we thought we'd spend our lives with. I understand that this is a practical arrangement, nothing more. But I also think Annie is a very wise little girl, and maybe we shouldn't dismiss her ideas entirely." James turned to look at her in the dim light. "What do you mean?" "I mean that maybe the heart is more flexible than we give it credit for. Maybe there's more than one way to build a family, more than one kind of love that can make a life worth living." She paused, then added quietly, "I'm not saying anything has to happen or should happen. I'm just saying that maybe we don't have to close ourselves off from possibilities." James was quiet for a long time, thinking about her words. Finally, he said, "My wife Sarah was the love of my life. I never thought I could feel that way about anyone else. And my husband Thomas was mine," Margaret replied. "But maybe that doesn't mean our hearts are used up. Maybe it just means we know how precious love is when we find it." "Maybe," James said softly. As the weeks passed, Margaret settled into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. She taught Annie lessons in the morning, tended the garden in the afternoon, and prepared meals that filled the house with warmth and wonderful smells. Annie bloomed under the attention, her reading improving rapidly and her confidence growing with each successfully completed lesson. James found himself looking forward to mealtimes, not just for the excellent food, but for the conversation and laughter that now filled his dining room. Margaret had a gift for drawing out Annie's thoughts and ideas, and for making even James feel comfortable sharing his own opinions about everything from cattle breeding to the best way to preserve vegetables for winter. Slowly, carefully, without ever discussing it directly, the three of them began to feel like a family. The moment that changed everything came on a crisp October morning when Annie was helping Margaret hang laundry on the line behind the house. Margaret was reaching up to pin a sheet when she lost her footing on the uneven ground and fell hard, twisting her ankle and crying out in pain. Annie ran to get her father, her small face white with fear. "Papa, Mrs. Margaret is hurt!" James came running from the barn, scooping Margaret up in his arms without hesitation and carrying her into the house despite her protests that she could walk. As he settled her on the sofa and gently examined her swollen ankle, Margaret was struck by the tenderness of his touch, the genuine concern in his eyes. "It's just a sprain," he said with relief. "But you need to stay off it for a few days." "I have too much to do," Margaret protested. "Annie's lessons and the preserving, and we'll wait," James said firmly. "Annie can help me with the cooking, can't you, sweetheart?" Annie nodded eagerly, then climbed onto the sofa beside Margaret. "Don't worry, Mrs. Margaret. Papa and I will take real good care of you, just like you take care of us." As Margaret lay on the sofa that afternoon, her foot propped up and Annie reading aloud to her from a book of fairy tales, she realized something that took her breath away. Somewhere in the past few weeks, without her even noticing, These two people had become her people. This house had become her home. This life they were building together had become more precious to her than the dreams she'd lost. That evening, as James brought her supper on a tray and sat beside her to make sure she ate, Margaret found the courage to ask the question that had been growing in her heart. "James, do you think Sarah would have wanted you to be happy?" He paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, clearly startled by the question. Yes. Of course she would. And do you think she would have wanted Annie to have a mother's love, even if it wasn't hers? James set down his fork and looked at her with eyes that held a mixture of hope and fear. "Where is this going?" "Margaret, I think," Margaret said softly, "that I've fallen in love with both of you, not in a way that dishonors what we each had before, but in a new way, a different way that feels right for who we are now." James was quiet for so long that Margaret began to worry she'd made a terrible mistake. Then he reached over and took her hand in his calloused fingers gentle against her palm. "I've been falling in love with you too," he admitted. "I've been fighting it, telling myself it was too soon, too complicated. But watching you with Annie, seeing how you've brought life back to this house, back to both of us." "So what do we do?" Margaret whispered. Before James could answer, Annie appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, her hair in the neat braid Margaret had taught James to make. "Are you two talking about getting married?" she asked with the directness that had become her trademark. Margaret and James looked at each other and started to laugh. "How did you know that's what we were talking about?" James asked. Annie rolled her eyes with 6-year-old exasperation. "Because you've been looking at each other the way the prince looks at the princess in my fairy tale books. And because Mrs. Margaret looks at you like you're the answer to a prayer, and you look at her like she's sunshine after a long winter." "Out of the mouths of babes," Margaret murmured. "So are you," Annie pressed. "Going to get married?" James looked at Margaret, his eyes serious. "Is that what you want, Margaret? To marry a rancher with calloused hands and a daughter who asks too many questions?" Margaret smiled, feeling her heart swell with a joy she hadn't expected to feel again. "Is that what you want, James? To marry a city teacher who doesn't know the first thing about cattle and talks too much during meals?" "Yes," he said simply. "If you'll have us, we'll come as a package deal," Annie announced, climbing onto the sofa between them. "If you marry Papa, you get me too. Is that okay?" Margaret pulled the little girl close, kissing the top of her head. "Annie Dalton, I can't think of anything I'd want more than to be your mama. If you'll have me." "I asked you first," Annie giggled. "That day at the train station, remember? I asked if you would marry my daddy." Margaret looked at James over Annie's head, both of them remembering that moment when a little girl's innocent question had planted the seed of everything that followed. "So you did?" Margaret said softly. "And the answer is yes. Yes to all of it." They were married 3 weeks later in the little church in Cedar Falls, with half the town in attendance. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and James wore his best suit with a tie that Annie had insisted on helping him knot. Annie stood beside them as they exchanged vows, holding a bouquet of late, blooming wildflowers from the garden Margaret had restored. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, Annie piped up with, "I object to waiting any longer." They've been being silly about this for weeks. The laughter that filled the church was warm and genuine, the kind of joy that comes from watching people find happiness in unexpected places.